Today at the National Press Club, Minister for the National Disability Insurance Scheme and Government Services, Bill Shorten. As the government seeks to future-proof the NDIS, a major review has outlined how the scheme can remain in place for future generations. Bill Shorten with today's National Press Club address.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the National Press Club and the Westpac Address, coming to you from Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, Canberra. My name is Laura Tingle, I'm the club's president. The National Disability Insurance Scheme was an idea that people with disabilities could once only dream about. A national scheme which provided for their changing needs to replace the patchwork system of state and privately provided services that so often left people trapped in their own homes. Our speaker today was one of its earliest champions when he entered federal parliament, and it became an issue that the Rudd-Gillard governments were stubbornly determined to implement as a legacy. It's had a rocky road, but has transformed the lives of many. Now, more than a decade on, it is set for a transformation of its own. To discuss where the NDIS goes next, please welcome Bill Shorten to the podium.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Laura. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the Canberra region, the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people, and pay my respects to their elders and to any other elders with us today. And I'd like to take this opportunity to speak directly to Australia's First Nations peoples in the aftermath of the Voice referendum. What I want to say is this: you are not alone. The long walk to reconciliation is not over. Millions of Australians have walked, are walking, and keep walking beside you until we reach reconciliation and complete our country. Now, the last time that I was here was April the 18th. Back then, the independent NDIS review was about halfway through its 12-month assessment of the National Disability Insurance Scheme. Today, we've released the independent report of the NDIS review, and I'm here to talk to Australians with disability and their families in particular, and the Australian people generally, about its important recommendations. Just a note, I won't be talking directly about the Disability Royal Commission. My colleague Amanda Rishworth is the ministerial lead, and for which the government is still receiving public responses on that landmark report. But returning to April, people were then anxious about the future of the NDIS, and people are still anxious. I respect and feel that anxiety, because no one wants to go back to the days of the misery Olympics when Australians were at the mercy of a broken system. No one wants to go back to the days when Australians with disability were forced to rely on charity to fundraise for wheelchairs or a place to live. No one wants to go back to that midnight anxiety faced by the 80-year-old parents, carers, as they do the dishes at the end of a long day, wondering who will look after their disabled son or daughter when they no longer can. So let me be clear. Australia is never going back to the bad old days. But we most certainly need to find a way forward together. The states and the Commonwealth, including the federal opposition. We all have a common interest and a shared responsibility to secure a lasting and constructive outcome for our citizens. We need each other. We cannot dance alone. The Australian people expect nothing less from us. Those community expectations remind me of something the late Bill Hayden wrote. He said Australians feel uncomfortable with extended public conflict and expect reasonable people to work out compromises. They tend to reject people they see as rigidly clinging to a point of view. It is therefore imperative to respond to seemingly reasonable offers. In other words, Australians are a practical people who just expect governments to get stuff done. More importantly, Australians with disability, their families and carers, they need us to fix the NDIS. Just like in 1975, Australians needed Hayden to create Medibank, the national health scheme that he called the Mark I version of Medicare. And just like Australians needed a Labor government in 1984 to reboot Medibank as Medicare, much the same can be said about our NDIS. Mark 1 of the NDIS, launched in 2013, has delivered remarkably for Australians with disability. And now we need to finish the job, to reboot the NDIS to deliver Mark 2 of the scheme. That reboot is the purpose of the NDIS review. The review recommends actions needed to be taken over the next few years to help get our NDIS back on track and deliver better outcomes, not just for Australians with disability, but for all of us. And this is important. These actions would not be delivered unilaterally by government. The actions will be developed and implemented with the disability sector. Yesterday's remarkable National Cabinet committed to securing the future of the NDIS so it can continue to deliver life-changing supports to future generations of Australians with a disability. National Cabinet agreed to implement legislative changes to the NDIS to improve the experience of participants, to restore the original intent of the scheme to support Australians living with permanent and significant disability within a broader system of supports. National Cabinet also agreed that the design of additional foundational supports would be jointly commissioned by the Commonwealth and the states. Today, I want to brief you on the findings and recommendations of the NDIS review. In my last Press Club address to the people, I explained why Labor established the NDIS and how, under previous administrations, it has veered off track. I shall not plough that ground again. But I do want to repeat something that I said in April. The National Disability Insurance Scheme is here to stay. It is not going away. But we need to get it back on track. This was the Albanese government's position in April. This is still our position. If anything, the NDIS review has reinforced this position. Now, the review was given 3 overarching objectives. 1, put people with disability back at the centre of the NDIS. 2, restore trust and confidence and pride in the NDIS. And 3, ensure the sustainability of the scheme for future generations. The independent NDIS review travelled to every state and territory, including regional and remote communities. It heard from more than 10,000 Australians, worked with disability organisations to reach out and listen to more than 1,000 people with disability and their families. Recorded more than 2,000 personal stories, received almost 4,000 submissions. In their interim report released in June, the panel identified 5 key challenges. 1, why is the NDIS an oasis in the desert? 2, what does reasonable and necessary supports mean? 3, why are there many more children on the NDIS than initially expected? 4, why aren't NDIS markets working? And 5, how do we ensure that the NDIS is sustainable? Let me quickly explain how the review found these key challenges facing the scheme. The review panel heard that when the NDIS works, it changes lives, literally hundreds of thousands of lives for the better. But it could work more transparently, more equitably, and more consistently. The review heard about the erosion of non-NDIS disability support since the introduction of the scheme, turning it into the only lifeboat in the ocean. Now, the review recommends ways to fix this design flaw. We need to develop supports for people whose disability does not have a significant impact on their daily life or impact their daily functioning in the same way. Or people whose condition just doesn't require the same level of support. Or people who don't need individualised funding to meet their needs, or do not have the same level of need as those on the NDIS. These supports, crucially, would create a continuum, so there would not be such a focus on being in or out of the NDIS. The review raised concerns that in the past, the National Disability Insurance Agency changed what qualifies as reasonable and necessary without any changes to the legislation, rules or operating guidelines. These decisions have led to confusion and contest in courts and the inconsistency of outcomes for people with similar levels of need. The review found that the costs of the NDIS were growing much faster than anticipated, partly because it's being used as a cash cow by some service providers. It found that the scheme's participant profile differs from the expectations expressed in 2011. Almost half of the participants on the scheme are children. None of the actuaries back then saw this coming. Other differences include the fact that support for children and families doesn't align with best practice. More adult participants need some support in decision making. The scheme hasn't properly, consistently supported people with a psychosocial disability, and demand has not slowed as expected. Another key finding concerns the NDIS services marketplace. In short, the market is a lottery, it's failing. It works for some people, but there are serious issues with accessibility, equity, outcomes, quality, safety, fraud. I mean, there is a world of difference between living in Sydney or Melbourne, or living in northern Tasmania or Longreach or Maningrida. One size doesn't fit all when it comes to accessing services. So we must, in the interest of participants, put an end to the simple acceptance that a laissez-faire approach to service delivery cures all. We need to shape and guide service delivery. We cannot have a five-star scheme for the wealthy professional class and nothing for the poor. The review's final key finding was that the National Disability Insurance Agency had historically focused more on control than delivering supports participants needed to achieve long-time life goals. This changes. It's already begun to change under the leadership of Kurt Fernley and Rebecca Falkingham. The NDI is working hard to improve the experience of participants in the scheme, and there are green shoots here. Before I move to the recommendations, though, I want to say a few words about the National Cabinet process. There was a lot of manoeuvring in the lead up to yesterday's National Cabinet and today's release of the NDIS review. But as happens, it all came together on the day. Real progress was made. With that in mind, I acknowledge the work of my Prime Minister Anthony Albanese and colleagues Jim Chalmers and Amanda Rishworth for their commitment to this project. I also want to thank the states and the territories for their contribution to everything, from the terms of reference to the review last October, to the selection of panel members on the review, to the secondment of talented staff to the Secretariat over the last 12 months. Because the NDIS review has always been a collective effort. But now we need to keep working together to finish the job and reboot the NDIS. The responsibility that we share is bigger than the eternal kabuki play of Commonwealth-state relations. It's about the lives of 1 in 5 Australians with disability. That's about 4.5 million people, 2.5 million of whom are under 65. So let me be clear. Our reforms are designed to ensure that every dollar of NDIS support gets through to those for whom the scheme was created. It is about our obligation as a society to assist Australians with disability and their families to be able to live a fulfilling life, to share in the Australian dream. But I'll go further. There are only around 600,000 Australians who are participants in the NDIS. So none of us are absolved from making society more inclusive and accessible for the other 3.9 million Australians with disability. So yesterday was indeed a big deal, a genuine breakthrough for all people with disability. Together, the Commonwealth and the states and territories have ensured that the NDIS will not be the only lifeboat in the ocean. And I congratulate my state and territory brothers and sisters. We will do this together. And this brings me to the independent review recommendations. The final report has 26 recommendations, 139 actions. The review makes its position plain in the final report, though. Each and every one of our 26 recommendations and 139 actions must be considered as a whole. Together, they provide a practical blueprint for a world-leading ecosystem that will put people with disability at the centre. For that to happen, it'll need to be well-planned, well-governed and designed and delivered in partnership with people with disability and their families. Now, rather than run through a laundry list of these recommendations and actions, I'll detail the 7 biggest changes. The first big change is foundational supports, recommendation 4. The review wants to create a connected system of support for people with disability and their families, regardless of whether they are participants in the NDIS. These are called foundational supports because they are the foundations for a good life, as well as foundational to the sustainability of the NDIS. This recommendation would provide new disability supports outside the NDIS and mean that the NDIS was no longer that proverbial sole lifeboat. There'll be 2 kinds of foundational support. General supports, they would be available to all people with disability, as well as supports targeted and specifically designed for people who are not eligible for the NDIS and whose needs cannot be met through mainstream services. National Cabinet agreed that the design of the additional foundational supports would be jointly commissioned by the Commonwealth and the states, and the Treasurers and First Secretaries will take a keen interest in our progress. This is significant work. They'll have oversight of the costs of the reforms and report to National Cabinet. The second set of big changes, though, relate to what we would say are better connecting people with disability with supports both inside and outside the NDIS. The review wants to give people with disability and their families more help to find their way around Australia's disability support systems. Currently, there is no single point of contact for people with disability who are trying to navigate the NDIS. This confusion makes it more likely that people will miss out on the services that they need. Confusion is a fairness issue, not least because the 2 largest cohorts in the scheme are autistic people and people with intellectual disability. The review wants to see the creation of 2 types of navigators. General navigators will be available to help people with disability connect to mainstream services, while specialist navigators would be available to help participants with more complex needs or circumstances. Creating a navigator workforce will take time, but I've got no doubt that many of the good people working as support coordinators and other callings will make outstanding navigators. Now, our third big change is the need to humanise the planning process. The previous planning processes have been bureaucratic, traumatising, even dehumanising. People say that dealing with the planning process is like a second full-time job, and preparing for a planning meeting sometimes feels like they're going to war. People are tired of having to prove every year that they're still blind or in a wheelchair or have Down syndrome. People are tired of having support budgets that make no sense and may well have been written for someone else altogether. Dealing with the NDIS should be simple and fair. Applications should be based on need, not rely solely on medical diagnosis. No longer, what is your label? But how does your impairment affect your life? As has always been the case, choice and control, and reasonable and necessary, will remain at the heart of the scheme. And evidence-based supports that deliver real beneficial outcomes, they're in, or in short, crystal therapies, overseas cruises and dolphins, they're out. If assessments are needed, they should be paid for by the NDIA. Access to the scheme shouldn't depend on whether someone can afford to pay for expensive reports. When it comes to determining how much funding a participant receives, that should also be based on their needs. Comprehensive assessments of support needs should be completed in person by trained, qualified assessors. And participant budgets need to be more flexible. Need should drive process, not the other way around. The fourth big change will deliver better support to children and their families. The review argues that the scheme currently focuses too much on the diagnosis of the disability and not enough on the supports that the child needs to fulfil their potential. As a result, early intervention supports for children are often delayed. The review just wants to ensure that children with disability and developmental concerns are identified as soon as possible to give them the best chance. They also want early intervention to be based on evidence and family-centred practices that are proven to deliver the best outcomes for children. I don't want kids enduring childhoods of 40 hours of weekly therapy where there's no evidence of it being beneficial. Kids deserve the chance to be kids. Not enough support has been given to families. And we know that children thrive when families are well supported. Importantly, it shouldn't matter whether these supports come from inside or outside the NDIS. I think it's recommendation 6, where the review calls for a more connected system of mainstream services, foundational supports and the NDIS to make that the support is matched to the needs of children and their families. And a key contact is there to help coordinate supports for a child or children. This person will be called a lead practitioner. They'll have the expertise in child development. They'll help coordinate a supportive team around the child and the family. I do just want to say one more thing about support for children and their families. There has been at times some unhelpful, indeed stigmatising commentary around children and indeed adults with autism. Identifying autistic people, singling them out in this debate about the NDIS is deeply unfair and distressing for autistic Australians. So it is to you that I want to speak directly at this point. You are part of not just the disability community, but the Australian community. You deserve better than unfounded gossip and needless anxiety. This review has not been about finding ways to exclude autistic people or leave children without much needed support. If you read the report, you will see it recommends removing diagnosis as the primary basis for entry into the scheme, because that approach is actually unfair. The recommendation is to create a unified, connected system of support, and most importantly, support levels that are matched to need. Your child may need a modest amount of support that should be found in mainstream settings like schools and kindergartens and childcare, or through the foundational supports which will be ramped up through additional investment. If your need is a higher level of support, then the NDIS is there for you. This approach is about making sure that every child, all kids, get the best chance in life and matching supports with needs. Now, the 5th big change recommended is in the area of psychosocial disability and mental health. Despite the best endeavours, the scheme hasn't worked as well as it should have for participants with a psychosocial disability. Current approaches to planning don't take enough account of the episodic nature of these disabilities. And in addition, services are not always based on what we know works well. The review says a new approach would better meet the episodic nature of serious psychosocial disability and mental health and focuses on recovery. That's at recommendation 7. So what would this look like? Creating an early intervention pathway for people with psychosocial disability. Coordinating NDIS services with the public mental health systems. Developing foundational supports for people with psychosocial disability who are not NDIS participants. And it would involve establishing new standards for service providers. I think introducing psychosocial recovery navigators to make sure that people have access to specialised support will also be crucial. To be very clear, it is the intention of the review that people with psychosocial disorders that are significant and permanent will remain covered by the NDIS. Now, the 6th big change involves creating fairer housing and living supports. Many participants don't get to choose where they live or who they live with. At best, this state of affairs is manifestly unfair. At worst, it risks condemning people with disability to segregated institutional life with minimal oversight. We should not allow this to continue. We have to get rid of the rauders and the criminals and the slum landlords who are using house and living supports to take advantage of people with cognitive disabilities and create real choices for people with disability. Decisions about housing and living funding must be fair and consistent at recommendation 8. That means making sure that funding decisions are only made after a comprehensive assessment of persons' support needs. Under this reform, most participants would receive funding based on sharing supports with 2 other people. Let me be clear though. If a participant's comprehensive assessment shows that they need more individualised intensive supports, they will receive that. Also, sharing supports doesn't mean you have to share a house. It is hoped that sharing would actually help people connect with others, having the flexibility to form crucial friendships to address the isolation faced by too many people with disability. Fair and more flexible and transparent funding decisions will help drive the development of more innovative housing options, enabling people to live independently while sharing supports. The review has a point. Innovation has been discouraged. With this recommendation, it would be encouraged. The evidence suggests that better design of housing can deliver more rather than fewer options for people with disability. To stimulate innovation, though, we need to create rules that are clear, transparent and fair. Now, the seventh big change from the review recommendations concerns quality, safety and integrity of the scheme. This is a critical area of reform because, frankly, it's our fellow Australians with a disability who suffer most because of the fraud and exploitation in the NDIS. In May, the federal budget included $48.3 million investment to crack down on fraud and non-compliance activities. But it is also why the review wants all service providers to be visible to the NDIA and the NDIS Quality and Safeguards Commission, so that payments could be reported in real time to help prevent everything from fraud and sharp practice to price gouging and plain old overservicing. And this is so that people with disability can choose from a range of quality services and know that they're safe. But it does mean that the NDIS would no longer pay unregistered providers, at recommendation 17. A proportional risk-based regulation system would be created. The level of regulation depended on the level of risk of services and the settings they're delivered in. We understand that we don't want to have one-size-fits-all red tape. But what it means is for providers delivering low-risk services, I don't know, to mowing the lawn, registration or enrolment would be very simple. For providers delivering more personal and complex services, such as in-home services, that would require greater oversight, and people with disability and providers would be involved in designing and testing the system to make sure it works before we finally introduce it. It will be brought in over time, not immediately. We don't want people to lose support, and we want to work through the circumstances so that we maintain the principle of choice and control. But we also don't want people to be at unnecessary risk. Now, these are big changes being suggested, but nothing is going to change overnight. This scheme will keep growing. The focus is on the future. We are doing things with people, not to them. The review estimates that the total collective of all of the improvements would take up to 5 years to fully implement. So there'll be many meetings and much cooperation and collaboration. But I do want to say this. Please believe me, I will fight every day for a better deal with people with disability and their families. There will be some people who say this affects their business models, that their special double-digit profits they are making may change. I say to them, if you're good at your job, you've got nothing to worry about. There'll be some who say that if you touch anything, somehow it's betraying the scheme. I reject the lazy argument which says that everything is too hard and therefore consigning Australians with disability to second best. I'd like to finish, though, on a personal note. My first job in politics at the end of 2007 was in the disability portfolio. That job as a junior minister changed my life. I went to places, institutions, group homes, hospital wards, where people with disability were shut away from everyday society, living in virtual exile in their own communities, living in virtual exile. You know, I met in that journey thousands of Australians, mums and dads, sons and daughters, friends and siblings, workers and carers, whose lives intersected with disability. And along the way, I learned so much about this country that I thought I already knew. Some of what I learned made me very proud, and some of what I learned made me very angry. I was and am proud of everything that Australians with disability accomplish every day in every part of this country. And I was and am outraged by systemic failures that hold back Australians with disability from achieving more. I learned it is not a person's disability that holds them back, it is the barriers that society put in their path. So over the past 16 years, I've looked for ways to fix systemic failures and to remove systemic barriers. I want to thank, though, the Secretariat and Independent Review Panel members, because they have been my teachers, both then and now. Bruce Bonahady, Lisa Paul, Judy Brewer, Kevin Cox, Kirsten Dean, Doogie Hurd and Stephen King. You've worked so hard to find ways to offer a map to Australia's horizon for people with disability. This landmark report, it is testament to your phenomenal work, your brains, your intellect, but also your heart. So in closing, I'd like to read a quote written by Stella Young, whom some of you would have known. I got to meet her. She has passed, but she wrote this in the days after the 2013 launch of the NDIS. She wrote, "While the NDIS is finally here, we're nowhere near living in a society that treats disabled people with dignity and respect. We're not even close. There are things that the NDIS cannot do for us as Australians with disability. There are some barriers that we face in our lives that no amount of funding can address, like discrimination and prejudice. Ramps won't start appearing where once there were stairs. Our libraries won't be filled with books in alternative formats. Negative attitudes towards people with disability won't magically be replaced by acceptance and respect. We have miles to go before we sleep." Stella, I know exactly what you mean. And that is why we strive for a more human, less bureaucratic NDIS. That is why we want to evict those who would line their own pockets at the expense of participants. That is why I am determined to finish the job. Thank you.
Yes, have some water. Thanks for the speech, Minister. If I could start with the crucial question of money, and as you say, quite an extraordinary outcome from National Cabinet yesterday. Can you explain, given Commonwealth state finances are always so fraught, do you believe that there are now incentives in the design of how you're sorting things out so that both levels of government have an interest in getting all those supports back which disappeared when the NDIS came?
Yeah, I think yesterday was a remarkable day. I would say yesterday was a day when the nation's political systems worked. I'm not saying that happens every day, but I think yesterday they did. Sure, there was some positioning beforehand and plenty of issues for the nation to grapple with: our hospitals, the GST, and of course the NDIS. But I think that the leadership shown by the Prime Minister and the Premiers was nothing short of outstanding. Now, it didn't happen in isolation of the week beforehand. The scheme was set up with a 50-50 contribution between the states and the feds. The states had managed to secure an arrangement where if the scheme costs increased, they would contribute an extra 4% per year, but any increase above 4% fell solely on the Commonwealth. So there's been a number of confluences which came together to, I think, secure the finances for the scheme. One, the rest of the world looks at us and says, wow, the NDIS is pretty unique and pretty special. You could travel to any other part of the world and this is an exceptional scheme. Other disability groups all around us of the world say, how did you do it? So my conclusion from that is there's enough money in the scheme. And I think we can afford to moderate the amount outgoing from, that's 15, 16% down to about 8%. But there's enough money. The question is, could we reinvest some of those savings in a system outside the scheme so the scheme doesn't essentially become the golden ticket? It's either that or nothing. So the foundational supports proposition, which was advanced by the review, they looked and said, all right, let's create a continuum so that there's less pressure on being in or out, and we focus instead on the needs of the person and lining up the supports that suit them. So I genuinely think it was a very important step yesterday, complementing the review today, which has said we think we can see the horizon, we want to work with people. The way that you ultimately improve the NDIS is you look after people on the scheme and you make sure that there's support outside the scheme. And we'll do that together. It's not about creating new bureaucracies, everything collaborative, working together. So I do actually genuinely believe that the omens are good.
Michael Reid has a question.
Michael.
Michael Reid from the Australian Financial Review. Minister, the NDIS review flags a transition away from plan managers. Can you elaborate why their services will no longer be necessary in their current form, and just how significant is the pushback you expect from both plan managers and other service providers whose business models have been essentially upended by the review?
The NDIS doesn't exist to serve a particular service provider. It exists to serve the best interests of people with disability and their families and the people who love them. Thank you. The taxpayer, the Australian taxpayer has done a really decent thing about funding the NDIS, and if you scratch the surface, they probably think that's probably one of the better uses for taxes, as opposed to perhaps politicians' wages. So they don't mind that. But they do expect it to go to the person for whom the scheme was designed. And, you know, we're working with the coalition, so I won't be too hard on the last 9 years, but I will say this, that I think the agency was undergunned in the past and didn't have enough resources. So what's happened is that, you know, nature hates a vacuum, and so does the NDIS. So where there was a need to help participants with decisions, where there's a need to help participants with invoices, if the agency didn't have enough people to do it, or if there wasn't enough clear direction, then business opportunities have sprung up, and that's fine. But now what we need to do is say, do you really need to pay a portion of your package to someone who you send an invoice to, who then sends it to the government? So I think if we can work in real time, and there's a lot of things to be done. As for the people who are working, most people end up in disability not just for the money. In fact, very few people do, other than some of the providers. But there's a lot of great people working in the NDIS world. There's 325,000 people. You can't just be a carer if you don't care about the person. There's a few, but most are really there for the right reasons. I see it every day. So I say that as we make our changes, I want to eliminate the ticket clipping in between the scheme and the person. The aim of the scheme isn't to see double-digit, 20, 30, 40% returns to particular businesses. It's to look after the people on the scheme and their families. I'm sure that good businesses have absolutely got nothing to worry about, and I'm really sure with the workforce shortage we have in disability that there will be more jobs tomorrow than there were today, and by next week we're going to need another 1,000, and by next year the scheme's going to grow. So this is a growth industry, and I want to make working in disability something that people see as a worthwhile career. But as for particular business models, it's not the job of the government to create NDIS millionaires, it's to look after the people on the scheme, and in a beauty parade I'm picking the person in the wheelchair, not the multi-millionaire business provider who might be making double-digit returns. If they're doing a good job, I love you, but you aren't the reason why I get out of bed every morning.
Thank you.
Sarah Bastard-Canales.
Sarah Bastard-Canales from The Guardian. Thank you, Minister, for your speech. The review proposes foundational supports over the next 5 years being brought up to a level where people on the scheme could eventually be transitioned to those supports.
Yeah.
Automatic access will also be removed if the government does adopt the recommendations. How confident are you that the gap won't just get bigger? And what's your guarantee to people who might be worried they'll be kicked off the lifeboat, as you call it, and into a sea of developing or yet to be developed foundational supports?
I can understand why people are anxious, because there's muscle memory in the disability world. I think about 60% of Australians have some exposure to disability, about 40% perhaps don't have so much exposure. But any one of those 60% know that families have fought hard. They fight hard every day. They want to make sure that their family member, or indeed the person with the disability themselves, fights hard to be heard, to be seen, to be included. So they will have a muscle memory. As soon as you use the word change, people go, righto, someone's coming after the bare things that I've got. That is so far from the motivation of this. What we do recognise is that this scheme is working imperfectly. That is not an exceptional proposition. Everyone would agree it's not working perfectly. What we want to do is make it a more human experience. We also want to make sure that some of the people currently extracting some of the $36 billion last year and the $41 billion next year, that those people extracting it from themselves, that it gets back to used more productively for outcomes for participants. But I can understand when you talk about change, people say, oh, I don't want to go back to the way it was. There is no radical change in this document at all. There is a definite endeavour to get it back on track. That's what made yesterday such a significant milestone. What we saw is state governments and the Commonwealth agree that there is a job to be done outside the NDIS. That is really significant. But we're not making change overnight or next week or even next month. Everything's got to be done with people. The scheme is going to grow every year. The scheme is going to grow by, was going to grow by more than 8% for the next couple of years with the best will in the world. But we hope to, in about year 3, year 4, get it to around 8% growth. So in a scenario where the scheme is growing, people should therefore say, well, that's good. In a scenario where we say we're going to be talking with and collaborating with, that's good. In a scenario where we say nothing changes overnight or next week, that's good. And of course, we've got to make sure that we actively create the foundational supports. I understand that is a condition, it's a package deal. That if we're going to make reforms in the scheme, that we also see the development of a more inclusive Australia. That is what makes what happened yesterday such a useful contribution. So I'm confident that as we work with people, as we work with our school system, as we work with our childcare system, as we develop our workforce, I'm confident we'll get it right. And at every stage, we will be listening. Thanks, Sarah.
That no one's going to be left behind as a result of this transition.
Yeah, that hasn't been my track record in the 15 years that I've ever been in politics.
Thank you.
Dan Jervis-Bird, buddy.
Dan Jervis-Barty from the West Australian.
Hi,
People
Dan.
with a disability might read the review, see what's proposed in regards to assessments and have flashbacks to what was proposed under the former government. What assurance can you give those people and their families that you're not introducing independent assessments 2.0, and if so, how?
The only word in common between this proposal and perhaps what our predecessors tried to inflict is the word assessment, but everything behind it's different. I'll give you some examples, proof points. The reality is right now, the planning can be a remote sort of affair, that you submit your details to a local area coordinator who then passes it on to a planner. You might get a plan. You might even meet the person who's doing your plan. So the first thing is we're putting the humans back into the system, that no plan can be set without the person doing the assessment meeting with the people about whom you're assessing. The other thing that I'd say here is under the old scheme, they were allocating 20 minutes an interview or half an hour an interview. These assessments are not time limited. Under the old plan, there wasn't sufficient focus on making sure that the assessor was highly qualified. So the what we're doing is different, the how we're doing it's different, but also what we do with the information is different. So who's going to do the assessments different to the old proposals, how we're going to do it's different, but also what we do with the information. See, what happened under the old scheme, or the old proposal, was that the model was that the decision would be made, that's it. When we do an assessment, they then got to go back and talk to the person who they've assessed and talk about it. I think another proof point, though, finally, if you're not already amazingly convinced, is the states and territories rejected independent assessments, but they've liked the process that we're talking about. But we'll keep working on it with them. Thanks, Dan.
Natasha Casanthos.
Hi, thank you. Natasha from the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. First, would you mind just clarifying to what extent these changes would be grandfathered? So specifically, will some people be moved from individual packages to foundational supports when they're ready and their supports are reassessed? And have you modelled how many people that would apply to? And then just a quick question on equity. We know that NDIS uptake for children has been higher in the regions of Australia where teachers and health workers are already in short supply. 5 years isn't a huge amount of time. How do you plan on surmounting the significant workforce challenges that come from establishing what's essentially a new foundational support system in those parts of the country?
It's important that journalists use their terms carefully, and I want to be very clear here when you talk about grandfathering. There is no one on the current scheme who's grandfathered anything. So you wouldn't want to develop a test of change which says that the only way that you will sign up to it or not frighten the readers is say, well, they're not saying they're going to grandfather you. You're not grandfathered now. But then let's move beyond that. These changes have to be rolled in conjunction with our other reforms. the scheme is going to grow in numbers. But let's go back to the speech, because I think that's a pretty useful reference point. In the past, people were getting onto the scheme by diagnosis alone. In some cases, parental diagnosis. What we want to do is actually meet the person who's to go on the scheme, on their family, and see what the impact of their diagnosis is having on their daily life. There's no point in giving a child the wrong services. There's no point in saying to a child, or family of a child, oh yeah, we'll just give them 40 hours a week, when that's not beneficial. So what we want to do is make sure that every Australian child who has a developmental delay gets on the radar. So that's why I'm more than confident that it'll work through. None of the changes we're looking at for kids would take place for up to 2 years anyway. In terms of your very important point about the workforce is a crisis everywhere in Australia on every issue. We even see it today with the Auslan interpreter. The federal government, under Minister Brendan O'Connor, but also Jim Chalmers, has proposed a whole lot of initiatives, including extra TAFE places. We've been working with employers, advocates and unions about how we can improve the attractiveness of working in the disability sector. You'll see recommendations there about making sure that people don't burn out and drop out of the industry by looking at portable arrangements in between employers. We also want to say to carers and to people with disability, there's not enough of you in your own sector working. So I think none of this happens overnight, but you've got a government who recognises that all of this does in some fair measure depend on workforce. But one of the factors though where the NDIS is distorting local markets is if you can get $193 an hour as an allied health professional doing one-on-one services, it's a lot harder for your school, which might need a special needs teacher or therapist, to attract you at much lower rates. So there's a whole lot of thinking got to be done on all of this, but we're across the workforce issue. And again, let's go back to, you say, you want to know a number. How many people are going to lose? How many people are going to move? We haven't modelled that. The point about it, and I don't think that's the right question in all fairness. I mean, you're entitled to ask any question you want. The right answer is, I'm interested in each kid. And at the moment, the NDIS is the only option for a whole lot of kids with developmental delay. That's not good enough in this country, is it? But Sorry, next question, thanks. Well, you've asked two.
Maybe I could just take it up just on the regional issue, Minister.
Yeah.
I mean, we do have these regional spots where there are black spots. You know, is anything that we're in the package?
Sorry, if I didn't pick up that point enough, I apologise. One of the things I said in my speech, which perhaps I need to make more clear, is I said, if you live in Melbourne and Sydney and trying to access disability services, that's way different to living in Maningrida or Longreach or Northern Tassie. I mean, Tasmania's got huge worker shortages in these areas. So what we need to look at doing is, in what we call, the jargonists call thin markets, is maybe we need to look at other ways of commissioning services. So right now already we're working out with the West Australian government for trials there. Nariar kit in the Territory with Maningrida. I know that we're working with the aged care portfolio and health federally to do new services down on the south coast around Eden. Like, we think that there's different ways to deliver the services which mean that people can actually utilise their packages. One of the inequitable things is you might have a package for $40,000, but because there's nowhere there to help you with the needs you have, you don't actually utilise it. So we think that it's not one size fits all, and we think that alternative commissioning, I mean, councils play a very good role here. We can work with the states where they might be delivering a service. How do we make Aboriginal controlled and community health organisations in Port Hedland? They might have 40 or 50 members of their community who are on the NDIS, but they can't use it. It would be better if we were able to say to them, listen, you need physio, you need OT, maybe speech pathology, maybe psychology. If we could work out a way that the person has the individual package, but that part of their package is funneled through an accredited service provider in a thin market, so that employer that can actually offer meaningful work to speeches or OTs or psychologists in that community, and everyone can actually get real utilisation.
Claudia Long.
Hello Minister, Claudia Long from the ABC. I guess just in an ideal world where we see all of these foundational supports built up, is there anything to stop a situation, for example, where an NDIS participant is referred to the allied health services that you've been talking about within a school or a hospital, and then they find out that there's a lengthy waiting list of a number of years. How are you going to guarantee, and not just you, but the government more widely, how are you going to guarantee that the states are going to come through on their promise to actually guarantee these supports? You know, we've heard a lot about the carrot. Is there going to be a stick?
Well, earlier this week, some of the media were writing the states said they wouldn't be engaged at all. But yesterday, National Cabinet seems to show a massive level of engagement. I'm optimistic that the states are engaged. That's why yesterday was significant. We'll work together on it. Like, if you say to me, please show me everything that 5 or 10 years' time and I want it right now, I can't. I can guarantee you this is the best plan in town. Now, do I think that there'll be some wrinkles in it we've got to iron out talking to people with disabilities? Sure. Do I think there'll be really good points made by service providers saying, is that too heavy red tape or not? Sure. Like, there is zero arrogance about this. But I put to you the counterfactual. If we do nothing, then it all eventually falls over. Well, that's just on all of us because we were too lazy to try. We're not going through, perhaps, dare I say it, the crude of things of rationing and say, you know, an algorithm says you get $10,000 and you get 20,000, you get 30, and that's it. We're not doing any of that either. I'm not saying this is the best plan, and I'm saying we will make it a better plan as we go along together with the states and with people with disability, most importantly. But it is the only viable plan. I am not willing to give up and say, well, because you can't answer every question on every bit of modelling and every bit of losers and winners and, you know, what about someone in 5 years' time who might not be on the scheme? I want you to guarantee that they'll be no worse off. You can't do that. What you can do, though, is say, we're going to keep them honest. If you're saying, how do we make keep the states honest? By doing this, by working together, by collaboration. The review is a serious piece of work. It's real. It reflects the lived experience, not just of the last 12 months, but of what a lot of us have been thinking over for a long time. So, and it'll be on you, the media, to help keep the states honest, not to simply print everything they might say to you. You know, we've all got a job here, but I'm pretty happy with the states, to be honest, and I know all the disability ministers and they're very motivated, so there's a lot of goodwill.
So just to clarify, that means if one of the states, say, falls behind in a particular development of a particular foundational support, instead of, say, finding them, you might approach them and be like, hey, how are you going to lift your game in this? Can you detail it to me?
Yes, that's a good way of putting it. We don't want to... different states are doing different things already. It's not like, I suppose the analogy of a lifeboat or an oasis sort of presumes nothing's happening. That's not quite fair. There is work that the states are doing. I acknowledge that, and some really innovative stuff. Just work together. I find if you can get a coalition of people with goodwill, people with disability, service providers, families, advocates, engaged members of parliament, politicians, we can probably solve most problems if we just decide what's most important. And for me, what's most important is the best outcome for the person with a disability. That'll help us sort out the rest of it when it gets hard.
Sarah Eisen has a question.
Thank you, Sarah. Sarah Eisen from The Australian. Just to follow up on Natasia's question, to be clear, some families who get individual support packages now could, in the 2-year time frame you were speaking of, go to the foundational system if that is best for them. I just wanted to clarify that. And Professor Bonnie Hedy has said the scheme was designed for 1 in 50 Australians. Do you think it's feasible with these reforms to return to such a rate?
Well, let's go to the individual, because that's who I'm more concerned about at the moment. And I'm speaking now directly to literally hundreds of thousands of families. We know that the NDIS is changing lives and we don't want to go back to the old ways. We do get, though, that the scheme needs to be run better. And part of the way we run it better is by developing more supports outside the scheme. This will take time. I'm not going to say, can I guarantee a particular individual is in or out, because frankly, I haven't done the assessment of them. I don't know how the child's going. I don't know what the circumstances of the family are. What I can say, though, is if you have a significant and permanent disability which has quite an impact on your functioning, you will be in the scheme. If you have a developmental delay which could be supported by another means of support other than an individual package, you'll get what you need. For me, this is all about what the people need, not about trying to fit them around a process. In terms of the number of kids on the scheme now, that you're going to Bruce's point, I mean, Bruce is very smart, so I won't try and put words in his mouth. But I did say in my speech that one of the things which we didn't expect when the scheme was set up was the level of unmet need. And we're getting better at diagnosing people. We're getting better at actually detecting developmental delay. One of my critics said that somehow I don't believe in autism. I believe autistic people are real. I believe the diagnosis. What I don't accept is that one size fits all. This is a pretty bold experiment. The idea you can provide individual support to our fellow human beings, I think it's a worthy exercise, but it's an individual system. So I think the more that we can avoid the generalisations and the more we get back to the needs of individuals and deliver it in the best way possible, then I think every family will be better off.
So not going back to the 1 in 50 as it was designed?
Again, I think you're looking for a particular word out of my mouth, and I'm not playing that. Because you know what? I really just give a stuff about people with disability and the people on the scheme. We're going to work every day for you. That's all I can say, and we will listen to you every day and we will respect you every day. And I'll make sure if a kid has a developmental delay that we create a system in this country that every child gets support. I'm just agnostic about the best way to do it. NDIS, childcare, schools, other forms of support. Thanks.
Andrew Probyn.
Bill Shorten, Andrew Probyn from Network 9.
I thought you were saying you were Bill Shorten.
Yeah. You're so much more
the years haven't been kind to you. Anyway.
Now, you've got quite a task ahead of you getting the trajectory of the NDIS from 13 down to 8. It's going to take a joint effort, but how much of that effort is going to be moderating the growth through tightening eligibility, which goes to Sarah's question there and also Natasia's question, and also from eliminating fraud, price gouging and over-servicing, which is another way of saying how much is being wasted through over-servicing, fraud, price gouging?
I think it's all of the above will contribute to the 8% target. But more importantly, it'll contribute to a functioning scheme delivering both inside and out for people with disability. It's hard to put a number on waste. It's harder to measure than, number of theoretical kids in and out in any particular year. My own gut instinct is that there are some people having a lend to this scheme, not the people on it, but there are some people who've been having a party on this scheme, and the party's got to stop. I do think there is waste. I do think there is criminality. Of course, it's very hard to put a number, as I've discovered as I argue with Treasury and Finance. What is the criminality? Because you've got to catch it to prove it. But my instinct is that there are improvements in terms of effect. If we make this a more human scheme, if you as a family and a person can have one person to deal with year in, year out, rather than 4 different people in a year, if you don't have to each year go and prove your disability again, your lifelong disability again, if you have 5-year default plans, if we have a system of prices in Australia which outlaws the ability of someone to sell you a protein shake and then they put the words NDIS in front of it and call it an NDIS protein shake and then charge more for it. So I actually think that that is the sweet spot, but I also recognise we need to clarify eligibility. We need to make sure that people are receiving evidence-based best practice services. We also need, the scheme is very much focused on providing individual hour-by-hour adult therapies to kids. In some cases that makes sense, but I think somewhere along the line families have been forgotten. I think it's psychosocial supports. The recovery model has been neglected. So I think all of these reforms collectively will contribute to better outcomes for participants, and that's what makes it virtuous. Better outcomes for people with disability equals better economics.
Mr. Shorten, is it billions going to shonks and shysters?
I can't put a number on it, but my people say between 5%. Listen, it'd be more scientific to throw a dart at a board, but I know, I get it, I get thousands of emails. There are some people having a lend to this scheme, and you really need to hear what we're saying here today. We want you to be accountable. Most service providers are excellent, okay? Let's be very clear. But I want accountability, and not every registered service provider is a saint, and many unregistered service providers are doing very good work, and they've been a very good innovative tool to give people choice and control. But there's got to be accountability. There just has to be accountability. How we maintain the social licence for this scheme is by prioritising the best interests of people with disability, with a sense that all of us as Australians are confident that they're not being ripped off by ticket clippers and people seeking to siphon off a portion of funds really just for themselves and not for the person for whom the scheme was designed.
Anthony Galloway.
Thanks for the speech, Minister. As you alluded to before, you were involved in the early stages of setting up the NDIS. Hindsight's a wonderful thing, but are there one or two things you wish you had recommended the government do all the way back then? Or is it a case that we had to kind of go through this decade-long trial to kind of figure out what were the problems for this next stage of the NDIS?
Anthony, if you've got to say your business,
Capital Brief.
Okay, that was Anthony Galloway from Capital Press. It's moved away from... He's a startup.
Thanks for the free advert.
Mr. Anthony Galloway. That's a great question. It's one where, you know, I can almost hear the gears in the heads of so many people here winding over. What would you do differently? I think it was always inevitable we'd have a Mark II moment. Would we do things differently? Clearly, we would actually do quite a lot of what we're proposing now then. But maybe it always had to be this iterative process. You know, and maybe we had to, you know, yes, I think I wish a lot of the individual decisions that have been made weren't made about individual packages and people being, you know, there's thousands of people had to go to court, all of that. So probably if I had one thing, how would we belt and brace to make sure that the agency was given more respect and had more resources? I think at a certain point, the very best ideal of the NDIA became sort of metastasised into we're a payment system and leave us alone about the rest of it. And I think that you can't pay billions of dollars out into the world to people and not pay attention to the whole disability system. I think some people thought, well, we've got the money and we pay individuals. That's the end of our obligations. So perhaps we could have had better leaders in the NDIA earlier. But, you know, like, we're here now and we'll just get on with it.
Sarah Tomevska.
Sarah Tomevska from SBS. Thanks for your speech. I asked you a similar question back in April when you spoke at the Press Club about the underrepresentation of culturally and linguistically diverse people on the scheme. I'll give a different example. I spoke to a single mum whose son was diagnosed with non-verbal autism at the age of 3.5. Until then, she didn't know what was, you know, the situation, and she'd never heard the word autism. She thought she was just a bad mum, which is really heartbreaking. So how do these reforms actually help culturally diverse people who maybe don't speak English as a first language, there might be stigma or there might be other barriers, actually access the scheme?
Well, there are some specific propositions in the report on that. I'll use an analogy, like how these foundational supports get built out is still a work in progress. But to use an analogy, one thing which I think works well in quite a lot of states of Australia is the maternal and child health nurse service. Basically, every baby that's born, every family gets access to, you know, someone who's understands maternal and child health issues. We would like to create that same sort of person for disability and developmental delay, so that you get a universal screening. There's been great work done by Telethon, by other Telethon Institute, but by other universities all around Australia. The way we pick up for not just CALD communities, but working class people or people in regions or remote First Nations, is that commitment to look at universal screening for developmental delay. And that's the sort of thing which we have in mind. And then you've got to have people who you can talk to. And that's where we're talking about our navigators. We also want to talk about, the review talks about developing a category of person in the system which are called lead practitioners. So you can go and talk to people. If there is a particular need, you can get funnelled into the right place. At the moment, it's too hard to find. So we need to, I think, comprehend disability as part of a child's development, or developmental delay has been one of the things we look at the same as hearing loss or the same as immunisations. So I think that would be part of it. Another part which helps core communities is, and I sort of referred to it generally in my speech about a sort of wealthy professional class and the others. I think the proposal from the review about the agency funding the report starts to make it a lot easier to eliminate the equity issues which you correctly identify. I know the agency's already been taking up steps from the new leadership about how we reach out to culturally and linguistically diverse communities as well. So, you know, having an agency that's switched on, that there are people who can't just simply just walk in and use the system as easy as others. I think universal screening, I think the creation of disability navigators in the broader community all mean that we start to identify the challenges. The earlier we can pick up a kid's challenge, we can then give them more options, and it just really can help a great deal.
Would navigators who speak other languages,
that's important.
Part of it?
Yes, there's no doubt that we need to. I mean, one good thing the agency does, and I think it's 17% of the agency are people with disabilities, but I know the agency's got to focus on recruiting people from diverse backgrounds, and that would certainly be a principle. Thanks, Sarah.
Unfortunately, the Minister has to get back for question time, so we're going to have to leave it there.
Oh, sorry about that. Yep, great.
So please thank him for speaking to us today.
Thanks very much.